The setting of a story is often an afterthought when actually it should be one of the very first things we consider. If you think of this strictly from the point of view of a character, one of the very first questions they ask is, where am I? The setting is the arena of the story, its time and place. And of course, those things tell us a lot about what's possible in a story, or what's likely in any case. We have certain expectations from a story set in the middle of a day during a rainstorm in a rural barn that we wouldn't have for a story set on a British naval ship lost at sea during the Napoleonic Wars. Two very different narrative threads run from these two settings. Our sense of setting is often based on prior knowledge. Even if we're not all that familiar with the city of New York, we have an idea of what it's like in contemporary life, and we draw that knowledge forward into our understanding of the story setting. We have a better sense, probably, of a dentist's office. Even if it isn't identical with the one in the story, we have an image of one in our mind, and we draw from that prior knowledge. Sometimes we don't have much knowledge. We have very broad generalizations. For example, we can't know what ancient Rome was like, but there are certain artifacts that we've seen in our lives and certain versions of stories of ancient Rome that give us a general impression of the place. We may never have visited an abortion clinic, but there are certain cultural ideas around that place that would help us to sort of identify what it would look and or feel like. Setting tells us a lot about character and opportunity, which is to say, what sorts of characters we're going to introduce and what opportunities there are to develop their story. So in a fish out of water story, say a cowboy in the suburbs, we're likely to have something in the narrative about how that person will confront different set of cultural values and have to adapt to them or change the environment around them. In a story where the cowboy is home on the range, then that we would assume that they would not only be versed in those cultural values, but it would in some way or other show prowess or show strength through them. Another way of looking at this is in terms of scale, because setting does also set the dimensions of the story. There's a difference between telling a story in a major metropolis like New York City and a smaller city, albeit like Little Rock, Arkansas. There's also a difference not only in terms of scale and volume, but also in terms of the scale of the significance of the story in setting your story in a 21st century cruise ship versus an 18th century slave ship, where there's a heavy sort of social and political history that comes along with setting. Throughout the semester, we'll talk about how various elements of story should evoke theme, and setting is no different. We start by asking the question, what sort of story do we want to tell? Maybe it's a story of corporate greed or someone feeling alone in a crowded place. And then the next question is, how well does the setting serve the telling? So if we set the story in a New York suburb filled with families of hedge fund managers, what does that tell us about corporate greed that, say, a story set in the financial district of New York might tell differently? If we set a story in an Amazon fulfillment center in rural Ohio, how does that sense of aloneness differ than someone who, say, feels lost in a foreign city? All of these things help to evoke theme in one way or another. If the story is about feeling separated or the story is about greed, we should feel that in the choice of setting and the way that characters play out their narratives within it. In the same way, setting can evoke symbolism. If a story is set in Philadelphia, we have associations with brotherly love, colonial history, cheesesteak, corrupt lawyers, freedom, urban decay, Benjamin Franklin, etc. If the story is set in Alcatraz, we have associations with prison and, of course, escape, but also failure of the penal system, in that it was supposed to be the inescapable prison that eventually someone did escape from. When we think of something even smaller than that, like, say, a tool shed, there's some very sort of broad symbolism around that. It's associated with rural individualism. It's also a place of beatings and violent crimes, taking someone out to the tool shed. It's a place of escape and of hiding, etc., etc. So when we choose setting, we want to think about what sorts of symbols those places evoke. There are also things that we want to avoid when choosing a setting. Probably the biggest of them is cliche, that we don't want our reader to be able to predict what's going to happen in the story simply based on expectations around the setting. So, an abandoned space station, for example, is going to evoke all sorts of stories from science fiction, as would a distant planet. Mystical kingdoms with creatures whose names are caricatures of Eastern languages are going to evoke ideas of the Lord of the Rings and of Game of Thrones, etc. And we'll have expectations about what sorts of stories might be told. Now, one can obviously take those very settings and upend them in some way and create unexpected stories, but we want to make sure that we're not walking into cliche and tipping our hand. The second is to avoid static settings. An empty room where the light never changes, or a generic space for characters to play upon. This is why we want to be thinking about setting right from the beginning. We don't want to think of our story and then choose where it would be set. We want to be thinking of our story and choosing the setting at the same time so that it doesn't become a blank slate, essentially. And of course, the problem with the blank slate is it becomes much more difficult to evoke things like symbolism and theme and to make the stories of the characters seem meaningful in a broader context rather than just in the context of their own story. And then, of course, settings should be in a state of transformation in the same way that characters should, that there should be something changing in that world. Or it may be that the character or characters are in some way the agents of that change, so that we can see, as we do in reality, a constant transformation of our experience. And finally, it should probably go without saying, but a setting should produce a powerful effect. Sometimes it does this through contrast, as in a fish out of water story, where someone is confronted with a different set of cultural values, and as a result of that, they are forced to adjust. Sometimes it's done more subtly through realism and small surprises, small changes, small things that emerge in the story that we don't necessarily expect. Sometimes this effect is produced through our own experiences, through weaving in bits of ourselves and taking characters in directions that are unexpected for our readers because they haven't had the same experiences we have. And sometimes this powerful effect is produced through acts of personal discovery. And that is, I would say, for the author as well as, and more obviously, for the characters. Something happens in their engagement with that setting that forces them to change or that forces them to see something about themselves that they hadn't seen before.